When making a Unity Tiny game, it's best to create a Bootstrapper to handle the initial state of your game. Hello and welcome back to another Unity Tiny video, where we will be discussing why you want to use a Bootstrapper, and then I'll be showing you how to convert a project with everything thrown into a single entity group into a project with multiple entity groups that are then instantiated in based off the current state of our game. The advantage of using entity groups over a single entity is the ability to organize things based off what its task is and what's required for that group. As in, is it a level? If so, it probably has your tile map, some colliders, and maybe your parallax. Then, you could have your character in its own entity group, with each of your character's animations as a child entity of a main entity within that group. We can also do the same thing for separating our enemies. Now, you'll need an initial entity group for starting your game. If we take a look at the Match 3 project, from the tiny samples, you'll see that they have a game state component that holds some initial data for the game. It also holds the cameras the game will require and the sounds the game will be using. This is a perfect example for explaining the usefulness of a bootstrapped entity group. Having the sounds and game state component within a Bootstrapper entity group, we can easily add other entity groups such as the dinosaur, or an entire cutscene, or even UIs, without having to worry about loading and deloading the sounds or the game data that were initially loaded within the Bootstrapper. So, if we open up the project we were working on in the last video, we will see how we can convert that project to a more usable project using multiple entity groups. If you take a look at this project, you'll notice that all of our entities are thrown into a single entity group called level. But if we open up the project that I've already converted, you'll notice that I have a Bootstrap entity group, a level 1 entity group, an enemy entity group, and if we go into the entity folder, open up the player group, you'll notice the player is also its own entity group. So what we will be doing is separating what you saw in this project into what you see in this project. The first thing that we're going to do is create the 4 entity groups that we'll be using. So let's go into our entities folder. We'll create a new entity group. We'll call this one player. Go ahead and open it up. Just drag your player underneath the player entity group. You can also create an entity group by right-clicking in your hierarchy and clicking a new entity group, which will create the entity group within your project, but after creating it will auto-open the entity group. We'll name this one enemy group. We'll also go back to here and rename this to player group. On the enemy group, we'll drag in one of the enemies. We'll delete the other 2 enemies. Save your enemy group and your player group. Now we need to create our level group. We technically already have the level group, so let's just name this level group and we'll create a Bootstrapper instead. So go ahead and right click either in your hierarchy or in your project and create a new entity group. We'll call this Bootstrapper. We'll actually call it Bootstrap for simplicity's sake. On your Bootstrap entity group, you'll just want your camera on it. And then on your level group, you want your background sprites, your tile map, and your colliders. Go ahead and save both of those entity groups. Now, we need to set an initial startup entity group. So the entity group the game knows is the default one. To do that, we can click on the bootstrapped entity group that we created, go over to here where it says set as startup, and click set as startup. This will set this bootstrap entity as the game's initial startup entity group, which makes it load automatically at the start of your game. You can now unload all of these groups if you would like to. This leaves us with nothing but a camera in our scene. So we need to come up with a way to re-instantiate the other entity groups back into the scene when they are required by the game. To do that, we're going to create another component for handling the state of our game, and we're going to call this component a game config component. And instead of a normal component, we're actually going to be using a configuration component. So create a new configuration component and name it game config. And on here, we're going to need a new custom field. So we're going to need to create another component, but this one's actually going to be an enumerator. This enumerator will be called game state, and it will hold the different states the game can be in. So we'll add a new field to the game state. We'll call it initialize. For when the game is first opening, we'll be in the initialized state. After the initialized state is through, it will load up the play state. Later we can add in a menu state, but for now we'll just go straight into the play state. Then if your character dies, we'll be leaving the play state and entering the game over state. So now that we have our 3 states set up, we can go back to our game config component and add the game state component to the game config configuration component. And we will name this state with a default value of initialize, because when our game first opens, we will be initializing it. We now need to go into our scripts folder, and we're going to create a new script called a game manager service. So right click, create tiny TypeScript system. We'll call it game manager service. Click enter and then open that file. Inside of this file, we are going to be controlling the states of the game and what should be happening during each of those states. It's actually a pretty simple amount of code. The first thing we need to do is get the data from the game config configuration component that we created a few minutes ago. So we'll say var config equals this.world.getConfigurationData, and then the config data that we want is game.gameConfig. Now that we have our game config data stored within a config variable, we can do a switch across the state and perform code based off what state the state is currently in. So we can say config.state, and then the first state will be case game.gameState.initialize. We'll then want 2 more cases for play and game over. If we're in the initialized state, we're actually going to be calling a function within the game services class called initialize. So we're going to say game.gameService.initialize. As you can see, this function isn't set up yet, so let's go into our game service file and create the void that we are missing. So inside of here, we'll put it underneath the set entity, or above the set entity enabled. We'll call it static initialize. We'll ask for a world, which is a ut.world. And in here, we're just going to instantiate the 3 things that the game needs and make sure to set the game config component to the state that we should be in after the game is finished initializing. So first we'll say ut.EntityGroup .instantiate. For instantiating an entity group, we want to instantiate it into the world, And the entity group that we want to instantiate first is going to be the level that we created. If you go back into our project, you'll see that we named our level group. So let's go back into the code file. And let's create a static variable for holding the name of the level group. So we'll say private static name underscore level. It's going to be a string, and its name will be game.levelGroup. We can go ahead and set one of these up for the player and the enemy. We'll call this name player and name enemy. Which is player group and enemy group. Then we can just put right here this dot name underscore level, and then we can copy and paste this and put name player and name enemy. Now, after we instantiate the 3 entity groups that the game is currently requiring, let's set the game config state to the play state. So we'll say let game config equal world dot get config data game dot game config. Then we're going to set the state by saying game config dot state is equal to game dot game state dot play. Then we need to set this data back to the component. So we'll say world dot set config data, and the config data we want to set is the game config. We can now save this, go back into our game manager service, and run this void or function. Make sure to pass in this .world. Now we can click save. And let's put a console.log to let us know if the game initialized or not. We'll just say starting initialization or starting init. Let's save, go back into our project, and see if this is working. You can see that even though in our project we only have a bootstrap and a camera, once the game loads in the browser, we have our player group, and we can move, jump, and fall, and we have our enemy group, which can also move, jump, and fall. Our attacking is still working, and we still have our ability to attack the enemy, and the enemy still has the ability to attack us. Excellent! This was a pretty simple video. I hope you were able to learn something. If you did, maybe consider liking the video. And even if you want to go the extra step, you could even click the subscribe button to get notified when my next video is released. But until then, I hope you have a wonderful day. And if you have any questions or comments, or are curious what the next video is going to be about, or want to make a suggestion on what I should make a video on, always feel free to leave a comment below. I always read them. Thank you and goodbye.